How can a land with more rivers than Europe and soil richer than America still be forced to import the very rice that grows in its own earth? In Kadogo, Burkina Faso, a new factory now answers that injustice, producing 400 tons of rice every single day. It was not born from foreign aid, nor from the leftovers of colonial hands, but from the courage of a woman billionaire who once began with only 300 francs, and from the bold leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore. For too long, our mothers were told that the rice of Asia was superior, even as their children starved in the shadows of abundance. Tonight's story is not only about food, it is about power, about dignity, about destiny. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will shake you. And before we begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because this is not simply news, it is history being written before your eyes. For generations, Africa has been drowning in what I call a hidden hunger. Not simply the ache of empty plates, but the deeper hunger of dependence, the humiliation of knowing that billions of dollars leave this continent every single year to buy rice from lands thousands of miles away. Pause and let that sink in. Billions money that could have built schools where children dream hospitals, where mothers survive childbirth, or roads that connect villages to opportunity flowing outward, while fertile soil lies untouched beneath the blazing Sahel sun. And year after year, ships arrive heavy with foreign rice docking at our ports like a ritual of shame, while African farmers with hands cracked from labor and hearts fractured by rejection are told that their rice is too rough, too small, too unworthy for their own people. Think back for a moment. Do you remember the taste of rice at your grandmother's table? For many of you in the diaspora, it was a Sunday meal stretched thin, a pot of rice blended with beans or lentils to make it last, to make it enough. For others, rice was rare, a treasure in a small bag, measured carefully, every grain respected. Now imagine a grandmother in Burkina Faso who, after 40 years, finally tastes rice grown, polished, and packaged in her own homeland. She lifts the spoon to her lips and whispers with tears in her eyes, "This is ours." That is more than food. That is a revolution born in the mouth of an elder. And yet here lies the cruel paradox that should cut every conscience. Africa possesses 60% of the world's arable land, more rivers than Europe, more sunshine than North America. And still we are told to import rice from Thailand, Vietnam, India. Why? Who declared our land unworthy of feeding its own children? Who grew rich from the deception that foreign rice was whiter, cleaner, more prestigious, while African villages were stripped of investment dignity and pride. Ibrahim Traore has spoken plainly. Burkina Faso will not beg for food, it can grow with its own hands. But let us be truthful, how many African leaders before him ever dared to break this cycle of dependency? How many smiled at trade agreements while their nations exported raw cotton, raw cocoa, raw coffee, only to buy the finished products back at 10 times the price? And how many of us in the diaspora shrugged and said, "That's just the way it is," shaking our heads, but never raising our voices? The hidden hunger is not only found in the dusty villages of West Africa. It lives in the spirit of every African child who looks at a continent overflowing with water and soil, yet starves for bread and dignity. It lingers in the memory of ancestors who once fed empires with millet, sorghum, rice, and maize, and yet whose descendants now line up for imported sacks stamped with foreign brands. Tell me, does this not ignite a fire in your chest? Does this not force you to ask, how did we ever let this become normal? Picture this: in Ouagadougou, a farmer named Issa bends over his field with a borrowed hoe. He grows rice with devotion, but year after year the market rejects him. He sells his crop for half its value to middlemen, while the same merchants flood his village with imported grain. His children eat foreign rice while his own sacks rot in the storeroom. This is the cruel insult of hidden hunger. It is not that Africa lacks the ability to feed itself, it is that Africa has been commanded not to. But in the shadows of that insult, something new has emerged. In Kadogo, a rice plant now gives Issa's harvest a home. No longer discarded, his crop will be cleaned, polished, packaged, and sold in the markets of his own nation. For the first time, he will not watch his rice decay in silence. He will see it stacked on shelves, shared in homes, and placed proudly on tables. That transformation is not just economics. It is healing. It is justice. It is dignity returned. So I ask you now, wherever you sit, from Atlanta to Accra, From Kingston to Kinshasa, if Africa has the soil, the rivers, the labor, and the will, why should it ever bow its head to beg? If your ancestors once sustained kingdoms and empires, why should you swallow the lie that Africa must import to survive? And if Captain Ibrahim Traore can stand in the Sahel sun and declare, "We will no longer beg," then what will you declare in your own home, in your own heart tonight? If you believe with me that Africa can feed itself not someday, not in theory, but here and now, then let your voice be heard. Comment, Amen, not as a habit, but as a witness. Because history is never written by the silent. It is written by those who rise to affirm the dignity of their people. Her name is Mamunata Baskavelegda, though many call her simply Mamunata Baza. She is not a politician commanding armies, not a general wrapped in medals, not a banker hiding behind skyscrapers of glass and steel. She began with nothing but 300 francs in her hand, less than a single American dollar, and the unshakable will of a woman who refused to surrender to poverty or fate. Before the rooster crowed, she would rise in the dark, balance her small tray of galettes on her head, and walk 15 long kilometers to the market. 15 kilometers on cracked heels and blistered feet, 15 kilometers where hope and exhaustion lived together in her chest like two stubborn companions. She was told that greatness belonged to men, that boardrooms and industries were not for women. And still she persisted. She sold, she saved, she expanded. From maize flour to beans, from sesame to rice, every grain she touched seemed to multiply until her humble stall grew into a flourishing trade, and her trade evolved into a company. And today that company has done what once seemed impossible. It has built Africa's largest rice processing plant. In Kadogo, it stands not merely as a factory, but as a cathedral of sovereignty, a monument to resilience. 400 tons of rice every single day can now be polished, packaged, and placed directly into the hands of her own people. Step inside and you do not see the remnants of a market stall. You see gleaming machines imported not as symbols of dependency, but as instruments of liberation. You see young men and women at the controls working with dignity, their labor no longer feeding a foreign empire, but nourishing their own nation. But here lies the truth the world would rather you never hear. Mamunata's rise is not simply a business story. It is a disruption. It is a direct threat to the machinery of global inequality. For decades, the script has been written that African women could sell peanuts or spices in dusty markets, but never sit at the helm of billion-dollar industries. The script dictated that Africa's wealth must forever flow outward, never remain rooted in its soil. And yet here stands a woman who has built an empire strong enough to hold value at home, and behind her, standing like a shield, is a president, Captain Ibrahim Traore, who refuses to let her walk alone. Do you understand now why her name is whispered instead of celebrated in foreign media? Why her success does not make glossy covers the way it would if she were in Silicon Valley or Paris? Because her triumph is not entertainment, it is rebellion. It is defiance against a global order that insists Africa must only supply raw grain, never own the finished product. It is defiance against a system terrified of the image of African women standing shoulder to shoulder with presidents not begging for charity, but shaping economies with their own industry. Let us talk about what this means in practical terms. Hundreds of young people in Burkina Faso will now find direct employment in her plant, and thousands more will benefit indirectly. Farmers who once sold their harvest for pennies will now have reliable buyers and fairer prices. Truck drivers will move paddy from villages to the plant. Retailers will sell packaged rice to families in markets. Exporters will carry surplus across borders. This is not merely Mamunata's wealth, it is a river of prosperity flowing into communities long ignored, watering the roots of a forgotten people. And still behind closed doors, the whispers grow louder. Rice exporters in Asia, officials in European trade ministries, financiers within the IMF, they all know what this factory represents. If one woman can rise from 300 francs to $5 billion of industrial might, then what excuse do other African leaders have? If one factory in Kadogo can challenge billions of dollars of imports, how many more could overturn the system entirely? That is why they stay silent. That is why they prefer shadows over headlines. But silence cannot smother the drumbeat. In churches across the diaspora, in mosques in Bamako, in homes from Kingston to Chicago, the story of Mamunata spreads like wildfire. She is no longer just a businesswoman. She has become a queen crowned, not with jewels, but with dignity. She is living proof that African women have always carried nations in the markets, in the fields, in the raising of children. And now they will carry industries too. So I ask you watching this right now, who are the women in your life who carry this same unstoppable fire? Who are the women in your community who deserve to be lifted, celebrated, empowered to build as Mamunata has built? Write their names in the comments. Honor them publicly. Let the world see that Mamunata is not alone, that across Africa and the diaspora, millions of sisters are ready to rise, ready to build, ready to lead. Because in the end, the truth is not hers alone. It belongs to all of us. When African women are free to build, they do not only build businesses, they build families, they build futures, they build nations, and nations built by women do not fall. The story of rice in Burkina Faso could have passed unnoticed, filed away as another development project, another ribbon cutting, another statistic. But the moment the factory gates swung open in Kadogo, the world's giants began to stir uneasily. The International Monetary Fund whispered its doubts in closed halls. The World Bank raised cautious eyebrows. Trade ministers in Europe and Asia muttered warnings of instability. How could a small Sahel nation dare to disrupt an import machine worth billions of dollars each year? How could Ibrahim Traore, a captain barely in his 30s, challenge rules crafted long before he was even born? It wasn't long before the first delegation landed. Men in pressed suits stepped off planes in Ouagadougou, carrying folders stuffed with charts, graphs, and grave warnings. Sitting across from Traoré, they told him that food sovereignty was a fantasy, that Burkina Faso's economy could not survive without foreign grain, that building Africa's largest rice factory was nothing less than reckless. Picture their faces when Traoré leaned forward, steady and unshaken, and replied, "What is reckless is to let our people starve while our soil lies rich and waiting." But the pressure did not end in conference rooms. From across Asia came murmurs of panic among rice exporters. For decades, their ships had sailed into African harbors, heavy with grain, and now they imagined a future where those same ships might return half empty. In the back rooms of power, lobbyists pleaded for action, urging Western allies to contain this so-called experiment. Isn't it strange when Europe subsidizes its farmers, it is called stability. When America shields its agriculture, it is called national security. But when Africa dares to process its own grain, they call it destabilization. Tell me who is truly destabilizing the world, the one who insists on feeding himself or the one who insists on keeping others hungry? Meanwhile, on the ground in Kadogo, the contrast was like day and night. As diplomats fretted and bankers drafted reports, thousands of Burkinabè poured into the streets to celebrate the opening of the plant. Women wrapped in bright cloth lifted their voices in song. Drummers pounded rhythms that shook the dust from the earth and rose into the night sky. Children danced barefoot in circles, their laughter curling upward like smoke into the Sahel wind. For them, this was not about charts or trade flows. This was survival. This was pride. This was the living proof that their country could stand on its own 2 feet without bowing to anyone. Among that crowd stood a farmer named Mariam. For years, her rice had been rejected as inferior, sold for pennies, or left to rot in storage. But on that day, she clutched a bag stamped boldly with the words, "Produit au Burkina Faso." Tears streaked her face as she pressed it against her chest and whispered, "For the first time, I know my children will eat what I grew." That moment carried more truth than 1,000 spreadsheets stacked in conference halls. And yet the giants did not retreat. Reports leaked of IMF officials quietly drafting conditions for future loans, cut subsidies for local agriculture, scale back factories, opened borders wider for imports. To them, sovereignty was a liability. To Traoré, sovereignty was sacred. So he did what few leaders in living memory have dared. He stood before cameras, Mamunata at his side, and declared, "We will no longer beg. We will plant. We will process. We will feed ourselves." The room trembled with those words. Across Africa, millions watched as the clip spread. In Nairobi, young activists replayed it on their phones, chanting, "If Burkina Faso can, why not us?" In Accra, traders asked each other, "When will our leaders follow?" In Bamako and Niamey, elders nodded with tears in their eyes, murmuring the names of Sankara and Lumumba, recognizing that history was stirring once again. Something had shifted, something the giants could not measure in charts or silence with threats. Still, honesty demands we face the risk. What happens when loans are withheld, when markets are twisted, when whispers of destabilization turn into sanctions? This is not only a test of Traoré's resolve, it is a test of ours. Will the diaspora allow him to carry the weight alone? Or will our voices rise from churches, from living rooms, from town halls and parliaments declaring together that Africa's right to eat from its own soil is wholly untouchable, non-negotiable? Picture yourself at that crossroads. If you see a young leader facing down giants, do you walk by in silence, or do you take your place beside him? If they label it reckless to build, do you agree or do you believe in the dignity of feeding your own people with the fruit of your own land? The choice is not abstract, it is immediate, personal, spiritual, and moral. The drums of Kadogo still echo, carrying across villages and cities, across oceans and into the heart of the diaspora. They do not whisper politely, they thunder with urgency. The question is simple: will we march to their rhythm, or will we allow the noise of the giants to drown it out? In Kadogo, when the machines roared to life, the sound did not stay within the walls of the factory. It spilled into the streets like thunder rolling through the Sahel. Yet it was not the cold hum of lifeless industry. It was the steady heartbeat of a people long denied the right to eat from their own soil. That night, families gathered outside their homes, and for the first time in years, the meal on the table carried a meaning far greater than nourishment. A bowl of rice was no longer just dinner. It was dignity steaming and shared, passed from mother to child as if it were a crown of belonging. Picture a mother serving her children, ladling rice onto their plates. They eat smiling, unaware that only a year ago this very grain would have been discarded, replaced by imports in plastic bags marked with foreign logos. But tonight the rice comes from their own earth, grown by their own farmers, polished in their own factory. She does not need to say a word. In her silence there is pride as strong as steel. She knows her children will never again grow up believing that what belongs to them is second best. In the village square, drums answered the meal. The chorus strings hummed, voices rose with songs their grandparents once sang under the same stars. Elders leaned back, their faces carved with time, whispering proverbs about harvest and hope. When the pot is strong, the village will not hunger. One elder said, his voice trembling with age. In that moment, the words were no longer just wisdom, they were prophecy, a promise finally fulfilled. Across the diaspora, scenes like this sparked memory and fire. In Harlem church basements, in Bamako's mosques, in Kingston kitchens, families spoke of the factory. Old men remembered how their parents were forced to buy foreign rice, even while their own fields stood fertile. Women recalled markets where imported bags pushed local produce aside. The flame of Kadogo was not confined to Burkina Faso. It leapt across oceans and borders, carried in conversations wherever African blood still beats. But let us not mistake this fire for romance alone. This fire burns because it has been fed by decades of hunger. Too long have our youth been left without purpose. Too long have women carried baskets heavy with crops they could not sell. Too long has the diaspora sent money across seas to fill empty stomachs that should have been filled by their own land. Now, for the first time, the balance is shifting. Every paycheck earned at the factory, every truck that rolls out carrying rice, every sealed package placed in a shop window is not just economics, it is a flame of restored dignity. Think of Umar, a young man who once dreamed of risking his life to cross the Mediterranean in search of work. On the day the factory opened, he stood at its gates, his first paycheck clutched tightly in his hands. Looking at it, he whispered, "I do not need to leave. I will stay. My future is here." That is the fire of the people. It lives not in machines alone, but in the hope that their children will not need to abandon home to chase survival. This fire is visible everywhere now. It shines in the eyes of women like Miriam, who no longer sell their rice for scraps. It echoes in the voices of children reciting lessons in classrooms built from the taxes of new industry. It warms the hearts of elders who once believed their nation had been forgotten and left to die. It is seen, it is heard, it is undeniable. But here is where your role begins. Fire does not spread by chance, it spreads when it is fanned. It spreads when people across the continent and across the diaspora demand their leaders follow the example of Kadogo. If one factory can transform a nation, then why not 2? Why not 20? Should the next one rise in Ghana, where restless youth wait for opportunity? Should it be in Nigeria, where fertile fields lie waiting to be honored, or in Kenya, where farmers dream not of survival, but of fairness. Think about your own land, your own family, your own children. If you could place this fire in their hands, where would you set it ablaze? Write the name of your country in the comments. Write it not just as a word, but as a declaration, a promise. For when you name it, you claim it. And when you claim it, you bear the responsibility to see it grow. The people's fire is alive. It began with a woman's courage and a leader's defiance, but now it belongs to us all. The question is no longer whether it will spread. The only question is how far, how fiercely, and how fast. And that answer depends on what you choose to do tonight. What began in Kadogo did not remain in Kadogo. The rhythm of the rice machines did not stop at the borders. It traveled like a drumbeat, carried not only by trade routes, but by imagination itself. In Nairobi, young activists raised photos of the factory and asked their leaders why Kenya, blessed with fertile valleys, still spent millions importing rice from Asia. In Accra, women in bustling markets whispered among themselves, wondering aloud why Ghana, rich with resources, could not build plants to feed its own children. In Bamako and Niamey, elders pointed to newspaper headlines and told their grandchildren, "Look closely, it can be done. Burkina Faso has lit the torch. Who among us will carry it next?" But while ordinary Africans murmured words of hope, the corridors of global power trembled with fear. In Washington, at the headquarters of the International Monetary Fund, a confidential report passed from desk to desk. Its title was "Blunt Risks of Sovereignty in West Africa." Inside, it admitted what no press conference would dare to say: if Burkina Faso proves it can feed itself, the entire multi-billion-dollar rice import system could collapse. Over $8 billion each year flows into the coffers of exporting nations, and one small Sahelian country threatened to upend it all. The report warned that the model could spread like wildfire, disrupting trade balances, dismantling fragile supply chains, and weakening the financial leverage of institutions that had long dictated terms. What the people of Africa saw as progress, the powerful labeled as a threat. Is this not the great paradox of our age? When the West builds factories, it is celebrated as development. When Asia pours investment into its farmers, it is praised as strength. But when Africa dares to build its largest rice factory in history, suddenly it is branded destabilization. Why must African strength always be seen as someone else's problem? Why is an Africa that feeds itself considered more dangerous than an Africa kept begging for aid? The pressure mounted quickly cloaked in diplomatic niceties. European trade envoys warned that Burkina Faso might be in violation of agreements it had never signed with dignity. Rice exporters in Asia lobbied their governments to shield their markets. American diplomats hinted that aid packages could be quietly reconsidered. Beneath the polished language lay one simple, unmistakable message: stop before this vision spreads. But Ibrahim Traore did not stop. He returned to the plant in Kadogo, cameras rolling, Mamunata at his side, the weight of a continent resting on his shoulders. "We are not destabilizing," he declared, his voice steady and unflinching. "We are stabilizing. For the first time, our farmers know their harvest will not rot in silence. For the first time, our youth work with machines instead of watching their futures vanish across the sea. For the first time, our women will never again be told that foreign rice is better than what their hands have grown. This is not instability. This is sovereignty." The crowd erupted with thunderous applause. And beyond that crowd, Africa listened. In Senegal, young farmers gathered in town halls demanding machines to polish their grain. In Nigeria, students debated in classrooms whether Traore's model could be replicated across their states. In South Africa, journalists pressed their leaders to ask why rice could not be cultivated and processed domestically at scale. The factory in Kadogo had become more than concrete and steel. It had become a mirror, forcing every African nation to stare into its own reflection and ask, what excuse do we have left? Still, let us not pretend the road is smooth. Dreams are fragile when faced with reality. Roads in the Sahel buckle under heavy trucks. Storage facilities remain scarce. Global markets are cutthroat, and foreign investors may undercut prices to sabotage Burkina Faso's efforts. Financial retaliation is not fantasy, it is a possibility. And corruption, if tolerated, could corrode the victory from within. These are not obstacles slogans can defeat. They are battles that demand strategy, discipline, and unity. So I turn to you, not as spectators watching a drama unfold, but but as participants in a story still being written. If Burkina Faso has dared to rise, what do you see as the greatest obstacles they must overcome? Is it the challenge of transporting rice from rural fields to industrial plants? Is it the search for fair and sustainable markets? Is it the shadow of foreign powers trying to sabotage sovereignty through manipulation? Share your thoughts. Write them down. Speak them aloud. Because celebration alone will not protect the movement. Movements endure only when they face their trials head-on. A continental awakening has begun. It is fragile, yes, but it is real. The question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can feed itself. The question is whether Africa will follow, whether the diaspora will lend its strength, whether the fire of sovereignty can spread faster than the cold winds of pressure. In Kadogo, the drums still beat, joined now by echoes from Nairobi, Accra, Bamako, Lagos, and beyond. It is no longer a solo rhythm. It is becoming a chorus. And the only question left is, will you add your voice to the song, or will you remain silent while history calls? History is never carved in whispers. It is written in fire, in sacrifice, in the courageous choices of ordinary men and women who decide that dignity matters more than fear. What we have witnessed in Kadogo is not just the hum of machines polishing rice. It is the thunder of a continent declaring enough. And at the heart of that thunder stands Ibrahim Traore, not as a ruler towering above his people, but as a brother walking alongside them, carrying their struggle as his own. But make no mistake, this is not only his story. This is your story. It is the story of a scattered but unbroken diaspora that has carried Africa in its prayers, its music, and its memory for generations. It is the story of mothers who stretched a handful of rice to feed 6 hungry children. It is the story of fathers who bent their backs in fields, knowing their harvest would never fetch a fair price. And now, for the first time in living memory, it is the story of a people daring to break that cycle, to reclaim what was always theirs. The world's institutions call it destabilization. We call it restoration. They call it reckless. We call it righteous. And if the global order trembles because Burkina Faso has chosen to feed its own children from its own soil, then perhaps trembling is long overdue. Because this is not the conclusion of a tale, it is the opening of a revolution. Think of what has already unfolded. A woman who once began with 300 francs, less than a single American dollar, now commands an empire that processes 400 tons of rice each day. A young president, dismissed by his enemies as too inexperienced, now commands not only the loyalty of his people, but the attention and the fear of global powers. A nation once branded weak and voiceless now stands as a torchbearer for an entire continent. This is not myth. This is not metaphor. This is fact, and you are watching it unfold before your eyes. This is not simply Burkina Faso latest news, it is the rebirth of African history itself. So I must ask you, will you let this flame remain contained in Kadogo, or will you carry it into your neighborhoods, your communities, your nations? Will you scroll past passively, or will you stand up and declare that the lie of dependence ends here? This is not a question for politicians alone. This is a question for you, for me, for every person who carries Africa in their bloodline and in their soul. Remember this truth: every bowl of rice eaten with dignity is an act of defiance. Every paycheck earned by a young worker in Kadogo is a victory against despair. Every truck carrying Burkinabè rice instead of imported sacks is a strike against exploitation. And every voice in the diaspora that rises to say, "We stand with Ibrahim Traore," is a shield raised against the giants who would silence him. That is why we gather here, not as spectators scrolling through headlines, but as witnesses to history. You watching from Harlem, from Kingston, from Toronto, from Lagos, you are part of this fire. When you share this video, when you comment your truth, you are fanning the flame. When you tell your children and grandchildren that you saw Africa rise with your own eyes, you are carrying the fire forward. So I invite you now, take responsibility. Write in the comments the name of a leader who must rise. Write the name of a nation that deserves its own factory. Write the name of a woman whose courage inspires you. Because when you speak, you do more than give an opinion, you give momentum. And momentum is the force that transforms sparks into wildfires. Do not be fooled, there will be retaliation. Loans will be withheld, sanctions whispered in dark rooms, propaganda spread in news cycles. They will paint Ibrahim Traore as dangerous, radical, reckless. They will predict that Burkina Faso cannot survive. But you and I know the truth. The only danger is to those who profit from Africa's weakness. The only radical act is to feed your children with the harvest of your own soil. The only recklessness is to accept hunger in a land blessed with abundance. So let the world spin its narratives. We will tell a different story. We will declare that Burkina Faso latest news is not about one factory, but about a continental awakening. We will proclaim that Ibrahim Traore does not stand alone because millions stand with him. And we will testify that this story is far from finished because the fire has only just begun to spread. And as I close, hold fast to this truth. We are not at the end, we are standing at the beginning. We are not begging, we are building. We are not silent, we are singing. And above all, we are not afraid. The drums of Kadogo are beating still, and their echo reaches into your home tonight. The question is simple: will you let that echo fade, or will you join the rhythm? Stay with us because the next chapter will not wait. This is dignity. This is destiny. This is history unfolding before your eyes. And this is Burkina Faso, latest news carried forward by the courage of Ibrahim Traore and by you who choose to rise.